My name is Delia Scott. I have been emailing you all, and this is the first session of something we're calling Greenhouse Educator Training. So this was put together with the Kentucky Hort Council, and it's being done with educators in mind, specifically ag educators, maybe people that have greenhouses, FFA greenhouses, or VOAG greenhouses. And so the topics are going to be constantly changing, and please feel free to give us any kind of feedback, maybe in the chat box during this presentation, like for future ideas for topics that you all want information on. Another note, this is going to be recorded, and I think we have a slide that shows where you can find it just for future reference. So like I said, this is the first one in a series that we're going to do in May. Also, we'll take a break for summer, and then we'll resume in September, give you all a break for summer vacation. So we do have two speakers for today. The first one is Dr. Garrett Owen. He is the Extension Greenhouse Specialist and also Assistant Professor at the University of Kentucky. He is our go-to for all things controlled environment horticulture, hydroponic production, floral production, vegetable crop production in greenhouses. So he's going to be doing the first part of this presentation, talking about structures and equipment, just basic things you can find in your greenhouse. And then we also have Mackenzie Fox, who is the Special Projects Coordinator at the Kentucky Hort Council. She'll be doing the second part of this presentation, and she'll be talking to you all about how to create a plant sales flyer if you do plant sales at your school, just a way to make a catchy flyer. So she's the second half of this. And again, if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop those in the chat box. And we will go ahead and get started if Garrett is ready. And thank you all for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you, Delia, for that introduction. Again, for those that are just joining us, my name is Garrett Owen, and I'm the Greenhouse Specialist in the Department of Horticulture at the University of Kentucky. And today is the first session of the Greenhouse Educator Training with today's topic on structures and equipment. And you may be wondering why this topic. Well, it was one of the most frequently asked questions that we have received over the past 2 years since I've joined UK, but also in a collaborative survey between Horticulture Council, Kentucky Hort Council, and Delia Scott and myself. So you may look like this staring at your greenhouses. I know some of my friends that are agricultural educators, they experience this as well. And that most common question is, how do I maintain my education greenhouse and equipment? So for me, that is quite simple. And that's what I'm here to share with you. First and foremost, to be successful, just create a checklist. So today's presentation is going to be about that checklist. So I'm going to talk about the different structural components and the equipment that you should look at least on an annual basis, if not weekly or monthly. Just, note it as a mental note or actually write it down in the checklist. And we are working on a extension publication that will have this checklist. So that's to come, but we're just going to go over and talk about some of these factors that you should be checking at least annually. So for those of you that have a Quonset-style greenhouse, I'm going to go over a checklist for you all. And then those that may have a different structure, such as a gable or A-frame style greenhouse, I'm going to go over some of those items that you should be checking. But then at the very end, I'm going to recap some best management practices, regardless of your greenhouse structure or the equipment, what you all can do to be successful. And I know it's not only you, but also things that your students can help you do to make sure that the greenhouse structure, the equipment, and the components are there and in operating order. So first, we're going to start with the glazing material. And the glazing material is often referred to as poly, as plastic. And if you have a Quonset-style greenhouse, it can be a single or double layer that has skinned or covered the greenhouse itself. So that is what's going to provide that protective environment within the greenhouse. That double layer of poly or single layer poly is what I have pictured here, is skinning that structure. It could also be on the end walls, but most times in a Quonset-style greenhouse, we see the end walls have a thick single or double polycarbonate in. So it's a little bit thicker, harder material than just this nice flexible plastic. So what are the things that you should be looking out for on your greenhouse film or your greenhouse poly? Well, you want to inspect for rips or holes like I have pictured here. You can see this large gash that is on top of the greenhouse roof. So if you have something like this or a small puncture, you want to go in and kind of patch those rips or those holes. A small hole like what I have pictured here at the bottom of the screen, that's easy to patch with some greenhouse film patching material that can be purchased from local suppliers here in Kentucky. But if you have a large gap like this one that I have on the slide, this may require actually taking some more greenhouse film and creating a patch and then patching it, almost kind of like a Band-Aid, for example. So other things that you want to look at is making sure that if you do use wiggle wire, to make sure that it is attached to the side of the greenhouse that holds that greenhouse film or that glazing material in place. And if it has a bumper or kind of a guard that covers up that wiggle wire, to make sure that it is also in place and secured. You also want to check and remove any obstructions that may cause damage to the greenhouse films. In this case, it was actually a tree limb that had fallen onto the greenhouse and has caused this rip. So anything that can easily fall or be blown onto the greenhouse, we want to make sure that can be removed so that you don't have a time where your greenhouse film can be ripped. Other things that you want to do is remove anything that can cast shade onto the greenhouse or into that growing environment. And when I say remove anything that can cast shade, that's within reason. You know, if you have a tree near the greenhouse, but it's just not in your nature to be able to remove that tree, you can't afford it, you know, you don't have to remove those trees, but just check for any some branches or anything like that that may fall onto the greenhouse. And if you are using that greenhouse poly or that that greenhouse film, you want to replace it depending on the type of material that you have, anywhere between 1 to 6 years. For most greenhouse film, we shoot for about 4 to 6, and that depends on if it's a 4 or 6 mil, if it's 1 or 2 layers. So you just want to kind of check that and keep that noted. I know some people was like, well, I did write it down, but I just can't remember. Well, what I have seen out with greenhouse growers, they'll actually spray paint the date in which that greenhouse was skinned. You may not want to spray paint a date as big and maybe as visible as what this grower did here. It may not be aesthetically appealing to look at, but at least you can put it somewhere on the greenhouse that, you know, is not being viewed as often, and you can keep track of when that greenhouse has been skinned. And it's like, oh yeah, it's probably time based off of the quality of the plastic, the glazing material transmissions being reduced. It's time to replace that greenhouse film. So with that, that's just some of the key characteristics or things that one should consider when needing to maintain the greenhouse film itself. Now, during the summer, there may be times that it just gets too hot in the greenhouse for you or your students or the plants that you're growing. And that's where you can use shade cloth to either be applied externally, so on outside of the greenhouse, or you can apply it internally by hanging it from the different greenhouse components. However, if you apply that external shade, this is what's going to help that heat accumulation in the greenhouse, but at the same time, you're going to limit light transmission. So if you have your shade cloth on now, for example, you are basically limiting the light to your crop. So when you limit light to your crop, that's going to reduce the overall quality. And the quality of the plant is based off the daily light integral, or the amount plants receive in 24 hours. So as researchers, what we like to do is determine what is that optimal daily light integral, and how we do that is using different shade percentages to manipulate the light environment to determine where is that threshold on daily light integral. And that's what we have done here with greenhouse cucumber transplants and also Boston ferns. And as you can see, as daily light decreases from 14.1 to 2.4 moles, we have a decrease in transplant quality of cucumbers. So basically the plants are growing under no shade all the way up to 86% shade. So as we increase that shade, that basically transplant elongates, the caliper of that transplant stem becomes weak, and it's easily broken when you are moving these transplants around on the greenhouse bench. However, if you don't provide any shade and you're growing transplants in the heat of the summer, it could actually be detrimental where you have sun scald. So for these cucumbers, we're shooting for a daily light integral of 10.3 to 8.1, and that's using 26 to 46% shade. So we can round up and say, hey, 50% shade is going to be good enough to limit the amount of light into the greenhouse without sacrificing quality, but in turn is going to mitigate the heat accumulation and make it a more bearable work environment. And if you look at the right side of the screen with the true Boston ferns, the experiment was very similar. And you can see that when we have no shade, the plants are very compact, but under 86% shade, the plants are very weak. The plant itself was very open and wasn't a very nice quality Boston fern. So in that sense, again, we're shooting for about 10 to 12 moles per meter per day in terms of daily light integral. So I talked a lot about daily light integral, but that is important when we're talking about the shade, because we really do not want to limit the light transmission in the greenhouse, but we will because of heat accumulation. So what are some of the key maintenance aspects that you need to look at when using shade curtains? Is that before you even apply shade, you want to inspect it to make sure there's any debris within that shade, because you're going to be pulling it across that glazing material. So say if you have a stick or some leaves in that glazing that's intertwined within that shade cloth, it could puncture that glazing material and just cause a huge rip over your greenhouse poly, and then you're going to have to remove it and then try to patch it, or if not, reskin the whole structure. So it's better to go ahead and take the time to inspect your shade cloth before even applying it to the greenhouse itself. You also, in the fall, when you remove your shade cloth, you want to store it in a dry location. Depending on the size, it could be a macro bin, it could be a tote, for example, with the lid, but you want to make sure that it's in a dry location so that you don't have any mildew, but also to make sure that no rodents can access it. Because in my experience, when I had a greenhouse business, did not follow my recommendation that I'm providing to you. And then that following spring, summer, I pulled my shade cloth out and had to basically patch holes for mice that had nested over the winter. So basically I ruined a $400 or $500 shade cloth because I didn't want to take the time. So don't do the mistake that I did. Just go ahead and take the time to put it in a nice dry location, and make sure that it has a lid so that no rodents can access it. When it comes to heating the greenhouse, we both have a unit heater, typically on the inside of the greenhouse, with the exhaust stack, which is basically going to vent any of the fumes from the combustion heater out of the greenhouse. When it comes to the exhaust stack, you want to make sure that the stack itself is capped so that birds, for example, will not nest. And also you want to make sure that there's no nest in there, because you won't be able to vent out, and you'll have ethylene to come back into the greenhouse, which could cause flowers shatter or drop, or even prevent plants from going into flowering or even fruiting if you're growing, say, greenhouse tomatoes. When it comes to the heater, for example, you also want to check the exhaust stack on the inside of the greenhouse. You want to make sure that the fan is operational, the blower fan. The heat exchangers, you want to inspect those to make sure there's no cracks on those, and I'll talk about that momentarily. And that if you are using a gas-powered unit heater, you want to make sure that the pilot light is still blue and lit within the chamber combustion or within that firebox. Now, if you're using a electric ignited unit heater, you won't have to look for that flame. So what are some of the maintenance for the stacks? Again, remove any bird nests or any other obstructions that may have come nested within the stack. Ensure that that exhaust cap is secured, that the wind has not blown it off. And for the heaters, again, remove any spider nests or spider webs, bird nests. I have seen bird nests in the greenhouse, especially if you leave the doors open during the summer. Check for that blue flame, that the heater is operational, and then you want to check for those cracks on those heat exchangers. So you may be wondering, well, what is the heat exchanger? The heat exchanger is the vertical metal pieces within a unit heater. You can see there's about 7 of the heat exchangers in the Modine unit heater that I have pictured here. But what do those cracks look like? When we take an up close view of the heat exchangers, you can see these cracks. This is a problem because ethylene will seep out of these cracks and will cause stem elongation on our crops. We'll have discoloration as well. So you can see where the heat from the unit heater in this instance was blowing on this Kalanchoe crop. You can see the discoloration, the longer internodes that stretched, the bleaching, and it just became a poor quality crop. So check those heat exchangers, make sure they're not cracked and there's no bird nest that has nested within your unit heater or your stacks. Moving on, we're going to talk about the fan and pad cooling. And basically this system is what's going to help cool the greenhouse during the warm parts of the year. So we have a pad on one side of the greenhouse that has water trickling through, a fan on the opposite end of the greenhouse, and it's basically going to pull air from outside of the house through that pad, pick up some of that moisture content, and then cool off that greenhouse. Hopefully about 75% of that greenhouse will be cool before we start to get some of that warm air accumulating, and then we're going to exhaust it out of the greenhouse. So with this type of system, we have multiple pieces of equipment that need to be checked. So for the exhaust fan, we want to make sure that it is expelling warm air from the greenhouse. So what are some of the maintenance things that we should be looking for? Is that we want to see that the exhaust fan is operational, that you want to inspect the belts. They do dry rot and sometimes they will crack. If you do see this, like in the image that I've provided here, you want to go ahead and replace that so that you can start expensing that hot air out of the greenhouse. And then you want to check to see if there's any obstructions preventing any exhaust. Insects and other debris, plastic can get caught up on the guards of these exhaust fans. So if you have time, remove those so that you're not restricting any airflow. And again, prevent anything from restricting airflow. I've seen in some instances where cardboard boxes that used to hold flats or pots would get placed up against these exhaust fans. You want to remove those away so that you can have nice airflow being pulled through the greenhouse and then propelled out. And then when it comes to the cooling pad, there's different types of equipment that we need to consider here. And we're going to first talk about that evaporative cooling pads. And basically they are a thick craft paper that has been treated that is going to absorb some of that water, and that's where the air is going to come through this porous material, pick up that moisture and help cool the greenhouse. So what are some of the maintenance characteristics we need to be looking for? Well, first and foremost, you need to check for leaks, such as pictured here. The end of this cooling pad system was leaking, was causing algae to grow on the concrete floor, was a slipping hazard as well. So you want to be able to check those leaks, fix those as quickly as possible so that you don't have to be topping off the reservoir as often. You want to make sure that your reservoir does not get overfilled. That can just become, again, another hazard within the greenhouse. Extra moisture content can cause some disease problems. You want to remove any debris that has basically been sucked up against these cooling pads and is limiting air transmission through these cooling pads. And that if you do take these cooling pads out, you want to check the headers for any obstructions or clogged holes. They look like large PVC pipe pieces with huge holes, about 1 to 2 inches in some instances, depending on the type of system, but just check to see if they are clogged. If they are, just remove them. And with the cooling pads, you can see here, there's some streaking. That streaking is wet dry. When you see that, for instance, you want to go ahead and replace your cooling pads. So with those cooling pads, replace them when needed if you start to see streaking. However, check the manufacturer's recommendation on how you can clean them. You will get a lot of algae built up, as I have demonstrated here. Sometimes windboard seeds will get stuck to that, causing more algae to grow. And then because our water is very hard, we have a lot of calcium, magnesium, we get scale. And you want to be able to remove that scale as well so that the headers do not get clogged with this material, and then it limits the water and then air transmission through these types of systems. So just be able to check those and always follow the manufacturer's instructions. With these type of systems, we also have motorized louvers that should be able to open and close so that you can determine how much air is actually being pulled through these systems. So you want to make sure that the motorized louvers, that there's no materials obstructing them from opening and closing, that motor is operational. You can see that the cover of our motor in this image here has been removed for maintenance. And then you also want to at least lubricate annually or directed by what the manufacturer's recommendations say. So just check those to make sure that those louvers can open freely. Within the greenhouse itself, we typically have horizontal airflow fans or HAF fans, and basically these are mounted in opposite directions so that if we are looking from an aerial view, such as the image on the right, and when these fans are operational, we get a nice rotation or mixture of the air within the greenhouse so that we have a nice mixture of the air, those gases within that greenhouse, and also help with humidity. So that's why it's important to make sure that we have our horizontal airflow fans in the proper location and that they're not being obstructed so that we can have nice airflow within the greenhouse. So the maintenance on these fans, I would say at least annually, is that you want to inject enclosures and make sure that they are free of any debris along with the cages. I know that butterflies and other insects will get stuck to these sometimes. So you want to make sure that these are free and not restricting any airflow, that the motor is actually operational and that it's just not burned out, and that you have not obstructed that airflow within that greenhouse. So we typically mount the HAF fans on a greenhouse bow, and that we typically try to keep 1 to 2 bows in front of that HAF fan free of any hanging baskets, so that A, we don't dry out those hanging baskets, and B, we're not obstructing any of that airflow. So I know that's wasted space, but we want to make sure that we have a nice turnover of air within that greenhouse environment itself. Also in the greenhouse, we have inflation fans, and these inflation fans is what blows the air between the, say, 2 layers of double poly, and that is what's going to provide that insulation barrier within the greenhouse. So with these inflation fans, there's a couple important things to note. Is that first and foremost, that you want to make sure the air is being pulled from outside the greenhouse and blown into the middle of those two layers of poly. You do not want to be pulling air from inside the greenhouse between those two layers, because it's warm, moist air from that growing environment is going to be blown between those two layers. It can't go anywhere. It's going to accumulate moisture, and that's where we start to see a lot of water forming between these two layers of plastic. We start to see algae and some other problems. So you want to make sure that air is being pulled from the outside, so cool, drier air. You want to also make sure that that motor is operational, so that you are inflating that space between the two layers of poly, and that the fan baffle is in the desired position, that you are bringing in the correct amount of air that you need to inflate your greenhouse. Now, sometimes these fans, they will lose their baffle plates. I have seen wooden planks, I have seen cardboard, they work just fine, but just check to make sure that they are basically still there. I have seen birds try to get into these fans, and also to note that it has motors inside, so try to keep it out of the way of children's fingers or young adults' fingers. So you have to be very strategic in where these inflation fans are mounted, but also you can put a cage over them as well. When it comes to the thermostats, we want to make sure that the thermostats are actually installed in the center of the greenhouse, so that we have an average or a nice representation of what that greenhouse air temperature is for both louvers, exhaust fans, and for the heaters. So when it comes to the thermostat installation and maintenance, you want to make sure, like I said, they're installed in the center of the greenhouse, unlike how they were installed at the end wall of the greenhouse. So in this picture that I have on the slide, there is two thermostats, one to control the heater, one to control the exhaust fan. The one that controls the heater is mounted behind the heater. So it's going to be inefficient in terms of heating and cooling that greenhouse as well. So just be mindful of where these thermostats are located. And you want to also make sure that they are not in the direct path of sunlight, heat, or airflow. So we typically see a cover over these because the thermostats have a wire coil on them. So direct sunlight could warm up that coil and actually have the exhaust fan turn on, when in fact you do not need to be exhausting or venting that greenhouse. So it's just something to think about with your thermostats. And that you always want to at least check these once or twice a year to make sure that they are operational. And if you have an injector, you want to make sure that that injector is providing the correct fertility, or if you need to adjust your irrigation alkalinity, that you are providing the correct amount of acid. So how do we do that? You want to check for leaks, make sure that you don't have any algae or any area on the floor that could be slick. You need to calibrate often and ensure that piston and plunger within those injectors are working correctly. Can you hear it clicking? Is it not clicking? So if it's not clicking, it's not drawing up and injecting that fertilizer into the irrigation water to create that nutrient solution. And that you also want to check, where applicable, if that injection stem is set to the desired delivery settings, such as 1 to 100, 1 to 200, or if you go off a percentage, making sure that it's set to the correct percentage of nitrogen that you want to apply to the plants. So that kind of ends the Quonset-style greenhouses. So if you have a even span greenhouse, a gable style, or an A-frame style greenhouse, the next couple of slides are going to be directed for you, and then we'll bring it all together at the end with some of the best management practices that apply across the board for everybody. So again, these glazing materials are slightly different. They can be single, double, or triple layer, and they are thick walled-like material, double polycarbonate or polycarbonate's very rigid material. When it comes to this type of material, if you have a misting system or a propagation system like this education greenhouse, it's going to likely cause a lot of algae to grow on the side walls of the greenhouse. So you want to go through with a soft cloth or even a low pressure washer and remove that algae so that you're not reducing light transmission into that greenhouse, thereby reducing your overall plant quality. Additionally, over time, this material will fade. The greenhouse on the right has an older material compared to the greenhouse on the left has new glazing material. And of course, over time, it ages and it's going to reduce your overall plant quality. So I know it's rather expensive, but it is just something to consider later on. With this type of glazing material, you typically get about 10 to 12 years, maybe 20 years, depending on the type of material, before it really starts to fade out and has to be replaced. Now, if you have an older style greenhouse that's covered in fiberglass, you probably experience this as well. This is called fiberglass bloom. This is where the resin basically wears away, just exposing the fibers, and those fibers can collect a lot of dust and limits that light transmission. You have to be careful with this, but you can go through and clean it. But again, you're working with fiberglass, and that can be for children or for young adults can be quite harmful, or even for us as well. When it comes to maintaining the glazing material, you want to at least clean it annually to optimize light transmission. And if you have any holes or cracks or any damage that you want to either try to patch it with some type of material, or if you have extra panels around, try to replace that panel. But it can be quite cumbersome to replace those panels. So it's just something to think about. Now, these types of greenhouses will also have a ventilator, but they may have a ventilator at the top of the greenhouse where it opens up and allows cool air to come down from the top and then is exhausted out of the greenhouse. So you want to make sure that the motors are working properly. So what are some of the maintenance things we should be looking for is that you want to check for leaks. You want to remove any obstructions that may prevent an opening or closing successfully of these ventilators, such as the obstruction that I have pictured here, and that's checking to make sure that those motors are working, but they have been lubricated as well. So it's just some couple key points when talking about these types of greenhouses. So to kind of wrap everything up, some other best management practices is that you want to make sure that you don't have any leaks between, say, where a wall and the greenhouse meet, if you're up against a building, or where the glazing material hits the ground or at doors. So the air that infiltrates the greenhouse will not allow your greenhouse to properly heat or cool. And can also cause some cold damage to cold sensitive crops, such as the asparagus ferns that I have pictured here, where the door was open and closing and we had cold air leak and we had plants to freeze out. So if you have holes, try to seal those, and it also helps with rodents entering the greenhouse as well. You want to make sure that your breaker heads and watering wands are not placed on the ground and in mud. This is just a great best management practice, and also helps with preventing disease spread. So not only do you want to keep them off the floor, you also want to keep them off the bench, and that you want to disinfect them often. I often say, as a rule of thumb, to disinfect at least after every crop. So get a new breaker head nice and clean in the spring, and then right before or right after you're done with your spring flower sales, you go ahead and disinfect it and ready for your next crop. You also want to sweep any of your floors and benches of any debris, potting soil, substrate that has fallen, and wash it down. You don't want any mud or anything like is pictured here. This education greenhouse that has also accumulated, which has allowed grass and other material to grow underneath the propagation benches. And just disinfect the benches and the floors with a greenhouse registered disinfectant. If you have questions about what type of disinfectant to use, there is an extension publication, I believe is on the Greenhouse Controlled Environment website, about what products to use. If you do have an injector, you want to make sure that the injector stock tank is covered. that you don't have exposed nutrient solution, which may also have acid in it. Have it exposed to students. So go ahead and get a lid for those stock tanks. You want to flush your irrigation lines to make sure we don't have algae to build up or even nutrient solution that has stayed within those lines and that could clog your emitters. And that if you do reuse pots, trays, hanging baskets, you want to make sure that you do sanitize them. If not, go ahead and recycle or discard them. It's just not worth the time and basically headache to deal with maybe a pest or disease that enters through the greenhouse from these types of materials that have been reused. If you don't have a concrete floor or gravel, well, if you do have gravel or just a bare floor, you want to remove any weeds from the greenhouse. This can harbor pests and also viruses. Remove any disease plants in the greenhouse. Do not keep any pet plants because that's where we typically see a lot of pests and diseases. And also rodents like to eat on these types of weeds. But if you don't have weeds, you have a nice greenhouse, you can always set out baits to help with any mice or rodent control, especially right after you sow any seed because they like to come in and dig up that seed and have it during the winter months. So with that, I hope I've given you at least a general idea of what greenhouse structural components and equipment to check on, maybe at the end of your spring growing season or right before the fall growing season, and also some best management practices to think about moving forward. So if you need any further information, we do have a new greenhouse controlled environment website. It can be found at www.greenhousehort.ca.uky.edu. We have fact sheets and other information available under grower resources, but if you don't see anything, please feel to reach out to us and we'll try to answer your question as quickly as possible. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Delia.
Thanks so much, Garrett. We appreciate that. So next we're going to hear from Mackenzie Fox, who again is from the Kentucky Hort Council, and she's just going to be talking a little bit about how to create an eye-catching sales flyer. Mackenzie.
Great. Can you guys see this and hear me okay?
Yes, you look good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me, Delia. So my name is Mackenzie Fox and I work for the Kentucky Horticulture Council. And today I'm going to talk to you all about creating eye-catching marketing materials. And we're going to focus kind of on plant sale examples, but all of the lessons in this presentation can be used for any marketing materials that you might use with your greenhouse. And so to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, we're first going to kind of review some of the different types of promotional materials that you all can use. And then through examples that I have found on the internet, we're going to talk about my top 5 tips for graphic design, with specifically looking at plant sale flyers and graphics. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about easy to use and inexpensive tools to help you create the flyers and marketing materials that we're talking about today. And so there's a lot of different types of promotional materials that you can use. If you do plant sales, you're probably mostly used to using a flyer, but there's lots of other promotional materials that can benefit your business, so to speak, in other ways. And so a brochure is a great way to advertise about your program. It's just a good way to introduce your program to customers, and you don't even necessarily have to be selling anything within the brochure. It can just be an informational flyer about your program. And you can keep those like at your greenhouse to give away when people come and buy plants. Or you can even have them in the school just so that people can learn about your program and then hopefully support you during things like your plant sale. I put door hangers on here. It's not something that's probably super applicable to you all, but you could consider using a door hanger to let people know if you have like neighborhoods around your school to let people know that you're having a plant sale. Business cards are a great way for a customer to directly contact you. So if you have your school business card or you make a business card for your greenhouse and your FFA program, that's just a great way to have your contact information on there so that if a customer has any issues, they can directly contact you. And then of course, flyers are the one that we're probably all most familiar with. Direct mailing campaigns can be really useful because the post office will send it out to whatever specified area you want to send it to. And they're not super expensive. We've done ones that were little postcards, and they're pretty easy to do. So that's always an option too if you're trying to find more customers. And then I put yard sign on here just because I thought that would be a good way. Like if you sell a bunch of plants to somebody, you could ask them to put up a sign in their yard that says like proudly grown by Whitley County FFA or something. And then that would just kind of reinforce in the community that there is this greenhouse that you can purchase plants from. And then of course, there's the online ways to promote your greenhouse, like website, social media, email, and video. And so my top 5 tips for you all today is, I'm just going to kind of review them really quickly here, and then we're going to look at examples that will portray each tip. So less is more. Text should be easy to read. I think all of us have experienced this where we see something that we can't really read the text very well, and it kind of deters you from participating or purchasing whatever it is that they're advertising. Including images of your products or your students from your program can be a really great way to sell your plants. Using color to your advantage. So color can kind of make or break you. So you need to use it well, not go too crazy, but also use color to attract people to your flyer. And then create brand awareness. And when I say brand awareness, I don't just mean like your FFA program, but just there being consistency across your promotional materials. And we'll look at an example of that here in a minute. And so what I did to display these tips to you all is I went in, on Google and just searched like FFA plant sales and found examples on the internet. And I don't think any of them are from Kentucky, but they're just from all around the country. And I chose the ones that I thought were really good, and then maybe the ones that needed some improvement. And so you can see here, less is more. So when I say that, you look to the one at the left, and it comes off as very overwhelming. So they have like a photo in the background, they have 5 photos in the center, and then they even have another photo that's totally different on the bottom. And so a consumer is not necessarily going to pay attention to what they need to be paying attention to, like the dates and what this FFA program is selling, because there's so many distractions by all the different pictures, and they're kind of all overlaid on top of each other. So it's just like almost too much. And so a good way to think about this when you're doing a flyer is like if you go to a library and there's like a community board, you want your flyer to stand out on that community board from every other flyer. And so if there's like a ton of stuff on the flyer, people's eyes are just going to go straight past that because there's not something that's like, unless they're really interested in plants, which they might be, their eyes are just going to go past it and look at another thing because they're probably not going to read every flyer. And so you want your flyer to stand out, whether that be on social media that you're posting your flyer, or even on like a community board in a library or a store. And so that I think is, if you can base kind of your flyer design off of that idea, then you'll probably have a pretty good flyer. And so you can see here on the right, this one's not necessarily perfect, but I like it because it's simple. It has 2 pictures, so it's not like too much like the one on the left. And it's very clear what they're selling, when they're selling it, and who's doing it by the big FFA logo. So another piece that's really important is font. And I'm sure we've all seen flyers that we couldn't read. And so just pay attention to what your font is looking like. And that means like what font you choose, but also the color. And so the one on the left, I like that they have a lot of different colors like in the background, but I think that the text, there's too many colors. And I think that the text on the bottom half is pretty hard to read, that kind of thicker text. So I prefer the one on the right, and the one on the right isn't perfect either, but their text kind of all matches, and it's not actually all the same font, but it all kind of has the same look. The only thing that I would change about the one on the right is that they put like the location underneath, like pretty close to where they're talking about the vegetables and herbs and what they sell. And I would move that away from there just to make it more obvious and more stand out more. Because I think that it does a good job of saying like when you can purchase the plants, but it doesn't, I think that the location can get lost in this flyer. So just make sure that your text is easy to read in both the font and the color. And a good way to test that is just to ask somebody else to look at it, and they'll probably be able to tell you. And then of course, images are always good. And if you're working with students, you have the benefit of a lot of kids knowing how to take really good pictures and having phones and being able to do filters on their phones. And so they can take some really nice images for you to use on your flyers. And so I like this image on the right. It's very pretty and colorful. And then the one on the left isn't necessarily bad. It's got lots of good information on it, but I just don't, it would be better, I think, if there was a nice picture on it to track somebody's eye. And if that flyer was on a big board of mini flyers and there was like a nice picture of a really pretty petunia, then maybe that would attract their eye to that flyer. And then color is also a really important piece. And this kind of relates to the font and other pieces that I've already talked about. But color, like I said, can kind of make or break you. So I think that the image on the left has a little bit too much going on with it in terms of the color because the background has lots of different shades in it. And I think that the one on the right is really nice because all the pictures kind of tie in together. So they kind of are using 3 core colors. They've got their reds, their pinks, and their greens. And all of those images tie together really nicely because they have those colors in them. And then the last piece that I wanted to mention is brand awareness. And so this is just a template I found on Canva actually. And I like it because you can have a flyer, like the image on the left is a flyer, and you could use that for your plant sale. But at the same time, you could use this template on the right, which is already made for you on Canva, to use on like your Facebook or your Instagram. And when you do images or flyers and Facebook posts that look similar, people will start to recognize it a little bit more. Like they'll recognize that they've maybe seen a flyer at the library and now they're seeing a Facebook post and it looks the same. And so then they might pay a little bit more attention to it because they've seen it multiple times. And so there's a couple easy to use tools that I would recommend. My first one is probably one that you all have heard of, and I think that students would really enjoy working with it. And I've seen many FFA programs that I think are using Canva. And I'll do a really quick walkthrough. I know we're a little bit over time. I'll do a quick walkthrough here in a minute. But the other one that I think doesn't get as much attention, but is still really useful is Adobe Creative Cloud Express, which used to be called Adobe Spark. And I really like their app. And I think that they have some really cute backgrounds. And so just check that out. That's another piece. But if you're only going to do one, Canva is definitely the way to go. So I just wanted to show you all, see if I can get my screen here, a walkthrough of Canva really fast. So I actually did my presentation on Canva, and I really enjoy doing that because they've got some really creative presentations, and they have a lot of templates. So this afternoon, I was looking for some templates that I could show you all as examples. And so I just searched flower. And then on the left over here, I chose whether I wanted a flyer, an Instagram post, or whatever. And you can see that they have literally hundreds or thousands of templates. And so I just scrolled through and found one that I liked. But you can see that there's just lots and lots of different options. And so I chose one, and I don't even know where it is at the moment, but I can show you over here. So I chose this one, and it started as a flyer, and I did just like a really quick threw it together, and wanted to show you guys, like, you can change the color of the font, you can change the font, you can change, of course, the text size, you can change the images down here, you can move them around, And then I think my favorite feature about Canva is that you can resize any like document that you're working on. So it's a really great way to have brand awareness, like I was talking about. So in this example, this is my flyer that I created from a template. And then I went and used this little resize tool and had it create a Facebook post, which I'll show you is right here. And so it automatically took the same information. It basically took this image and put it on the more square image or the square template of Facebook. And I made a copy of this photo or of this image and put them in the corner just to make them look a little bit better. And so you can just play around with it. And I'd really encourage you, there's a free version of Canva. There's also a paid version. The free version you can get by with. You just don't have access to as many templates. And the paid version, in my mind, is worth it because there are so many different images that you get to use. There's actually audio and videos that they have that you can use. And so I think the paid version is worth it, but you can definitely get by, especially with working with students who will be really creative, and you can have 20 of them working on different ones, different flyers at once. They could probably get around that, but just with me working on my own flyers and such, I like to have the paid version. And so with that, I know that was super fast. You can feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my phone number and my email in the chat, and I'm happy to help you with any Canva questions or flyer and design questions as well.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie. That was great. I've never used Canva, so that was really good. I might have to use those tricks also. So that's going to wrap up our first session of this, you all. For educators that are on here, there is a survey, I think, that Cindy has put out here. Please give us feedback on this. Any suggestions for topics, anything else that you all want to know. We are having a second session, which is on May 16th. You all will get notice about that, but it'll be Jonathan Larson talking about insect problems in greenhouses, just some things to look out for. But again, this is being put on with educators in mind. We are trying to help you all be successful. So again, please, any comments, any questions, and thank you all so much for attending. We appreciate it. Have a good evening.